He was just an old farmer, tending to a dying patch of land. Then the slavers brought him an orc girl who'd been sold twice before, and he tore her contract in half. The air in the valley was always thin and cold, even in the months that passed for summer. Elias felt it in his bones, a permanent ache that had settled in years ago and never left. It was a companion of sorts. His farm was the last patch of worked earth before the Broken Teeth Mountains began their jagged climb into the clouds. He had inherited the isolation from his father, who had inherited it from his. They were men who preferred the company of stone and stubborn soil. He remembered his wife, Elara, trying to bring life to the place with pots of mountain wildflowers. The flowers always died. The stones remained. His days were a rhythm of chores, a litany of small, necessary labors that kept the silence at bay. He split wood, mended the dry stone walls that bordered his meager fields, turned the soil, and checked his snares. He ate his meals alone, a hunk of dry bread, and whatever salted meat was left from the last pig. The quiet of the house was a heavy blanket. Sometimes he spoke to the ghosts of his wife and son, his voice a dry rasp in the stillness. He told them about the rust on the plough, about the fox that had been sniffing around the chicken coop. They never answered. He was mending a leather strap on the porch, his hands chapped and stiff, when he heard them. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a rock slide. It was the jangle of cheap iron and the wet, ugly sound of men spitting. Elias went still, his head cocked. Visitors were rare. Unwelcome visitors were the rule. He slid the awl back into its leather roll and stood slowly, his knees cracking a complaint. 3 men were trudging up the path from the valley road, their boots turning the dark earth. They led a 4th figure on a rope. Even from a distance he knew. An orc. He had seen them before, in chains, on their way to the mines in the east or the fighting pits in the south. He'd never seen one this close. She was tall, even hunched over as she was, her frame whip-thin under a filthy tunic. Her skin was the colour of slate, her dark hair matted with mud and something that looked like dried blood. A heavy iron collar was locked around her neck, the chain leading to the fist of the man in front. Elias stayed on his porch, his hand resting on the smooth, worn wood of the railing. He made his face a blank mask, the one he wore when traders tried to cheat him on the price of grain. The men stopped at the edge of his yard. The leader, a man with a blotchy face and a gut that strained the rivets on his leather jerkin, gave a yellow-toothed smile. "Just the man we were looking for," the leader grunted. "The hermit of Greyfall." Elias said nothing. He waited. Patience was a tool, like a shovel or an axe. You just had to know how to use it. "Got some merchandise here," the man continued, yanking the chain. The orc stumbled but didn't fall. She caught her balance with a fluid grace that seemed out of place with her condition. Her head came up just for a second, and her eyes met his. They were the colour of dark amber, and they held a fire that all the chains and filth in the world couldn't put out. There was no pleading in them, no fear, only a cold, bottomless contempt. "The iron mines ain't buying," the slaver said, kicking a loose stone. "Got too many of the green bastards already. The pit's at Thorn a week's travel south. Word is, you keep to yourself. Got a bit of coin saved up, maybe? Need a hand on the farm? This one's strong. A bit surly, but we've beaten most of that out of her. He spat again. Elias's eyes moved from the man to the orc. She had wounds, a deep gash on her arm, crudely stitched, bruises mottling her grey skin. She was breathing shallowly, favouring one side. Broken ribs, most likely. She stood in the dirt of his yard like a captive queen, her stillness a defiance more potent than any scream. He saw the faint, intricate lines of tattoos on her cheekbones, faded and scarred over. They spoke of a life before the collar. He thought of his fields, of the endless work. He thought of the silence. He was old. The work was getting harder. A hired hand was a foolish dream. No one would come this far out. A slave. His father had called it a sin. A man's labour is his own, he'd always said. To steal it is to steal his soul. How much? Elias heard his own voice, and it sounded like a stranger's. The slaver's smile widened. A smart man. She's been sold twice already. First owner didn't have the stomach for her. Second one, well, he had an accident. Price is low on account of her reputation. 20 silver pieces. It was most of what he had. His savings for the winter, for seed, for a new axe head. It was a stupid, ruinous price. He looked at her again. Her gaze was still on him, unwavering. It was a challenge. What kind of man are you? He went inside without a word. The slavers chuckled. He pulled the small, heavy coin purse from the loose stone in the hearth. He counted out 20 silver pieces, their surfaces dull in the dim light. His hands did not shake. He walked back out onto the porch and dropped the coins, one by one, into the slaver's grimy, outstretched palm. The man's eyes glittered with greed. He handed Elias a rolled piece of parchment, the bill of sale, stained and smelling of sweat. "Pleasure doing business," he grunted. He unlocked the chain from his belt and tossed the end into the dirt at Elias's feet. "She's all yours. Don't turn your back on her." The 3 men turned and walked away, laughing, their pockets heavier. They didn't look back. Elias stood on the porch, the parchment in one hand, the end of the chain in the other. The orc had not moved. She just watched him, her amber eyes burning with a cold light. He could feel the weight of the moment, the turning of a page in the quiet, dusty book of his life. He looked down at the contract in his hand. It listed her as female orc, age unknown, sound of limb, branded. It was a lie. She was half dead. It was a receipt for a soul. He met her gaze. Then, slowly and deliberately, he tore the contract in half, and then in half again. He let the pieces fall from his fingers and flutter to the ground. He dropped the chain. It landed in the dirt with a soft clink. He expected a reaction, surprise, relief, suspicion. He got nothing. Her expression did not change, her posture did not soften. "The barn," he said, his voice rough. "There's a clean stall, water." He turned and walked toward the barn, not waiting to see if she would follow. He didn't look back. He felt her eyes on his spine, sharp as a blade. He heard the scuff of her bare feet in the dirt behind him. She was following. The first choice had been his. The next would be hers. He led her into the cool, dusty air of the barn. It smelled of hay and animals and time. He pointed to the last stall, the one he used for birthing ewes. It had fresh straw, a bucket of clean water from the well, and a bit of privacy. "Stay," he said. It wasn't an order, it was a suggestion. She walked into the stall without a word. She didn't look at the water or the straw. She turned and leaned against the far wall, her arms crossed over her chest, and watched him, always watching. The iron collar was a dark, brutal line against her grey throat. Elias hesitated. He should go. He should leave her be. But the gash on her arm was seeping, and the way she held herself spoke of a pain she refused to show. He thought of Elara, how she would scold him for leaving any creature to suffer, man or beast. He turned and went back to the house. He returned with a wooden bowl of warm water, a clean rag, and a pot of salve. The salve was his own creation, a mix of comfrey and yarrow that smelled of the earth. He set the items on the ground just outside the stall. "For the arm," he said, not meeting her eyes. He expected her to lash out, to refuse. Instead, she just stared at the bowl, then back at him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "What do you want?" she finally asked. Her voice was deeper than he'd expected, a low rasp, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had spoken to him. "Nothing," he said, and it was the truth. He didn't know why he'd done it. It was a fool's act, an old man's whim. "The wound will fester." "Let it." "No," he said, his own stubbornness surprising him. "I paid for you. I won't have my property die of rot in the first hour." He used the word property like a shield, a way to explain his actions to himself. It felt like a lie in his mouth. She gave a short, harsh laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "You think you own me, human?" "I own a piece of paper I tore up," he said. "And I own this barn. You're in it. That wound needs cleaning." He took a step forward into the stall. She tensed, her body coiling like a spring. He could see the muscles in her shoulders and back bunch under the tunic. She could kill him. Even wounded, she could snap his neck before he could draw a breath. He knew it. He saw that she knew it too. He stopped, holding up his empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Everyone hurts me," she whispered, the words so low he barely caught them. He knelt slowly, his old knees protesting. He dipped the rag in the warm water and held it out. "Then I'll be the first one who doesn't." She watched his hand, his face, her eyes searching for the trick, the lie. He kept his hand steady. The barn was quiet except for the buzz of a fly and the sound of his own breathing. Minutes passed. He thought she would refuse. Then, with an agonizing slowness, she uncrossed her arms and held out the wounded one. Her skin was cool to the touch. He worked gently, cleaning the grime and dried blood away from the crude stitches. The wound was deep, the flesh around it inflamed. Underneath the dirt, her skin was a network of old scars, a roadmap of a hard life. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task. He was a farmer. He knew how to mend broken things. Fences, tools, animals. Maybe people, too. When he was done cleaning it, he took a dollop of the green salve and spread it carefully over the angry flesh. She flinched when his fingers touched her, but she didn't pull away. He wrapped the arm in a strip of clean linen, tying it off with a gentle knot. He stood up, his knees aching fiercely now. "There's bread and cheese on the table in the house, if you want it." He turned and left her there, not looking back. He had done what he could. He went about his evening chores, his mind a whirl. He had spent his life's savings on a wounded, hostile orc who could kill him in his sleep. He had invited a storm into his quiet house. He should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than the dull ache of absence. He felt awake. That night he slept in the chair by the cold hearth, the old wood axe resting on the floor beside him. He didn't truly expect an attack, but a fool and his life were soon parted. He left the door unbarred. If she wanted to leave, she could. He drifted in and out of a light, uneasy sleep, listening to the sounds of the night. He woke just before dawn to a strange sound, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. He sat up, his heart hammering, and grabbed the axe. He crept to the window and peered out into the grey, pre-dawn light. It was her. She was in the woodyard, his spare axe in her hands. She was splitting the logs he had hauled down from the woods yesterday. Each swing was precise, economical, powerful. She moved with a warrior's grace despite her injuries. The axe head flashed. The wood exploded apart. Thump. Crack. She was working through the pain, her jaw set. He watched her for a long time. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was working. It was a statement. I pay my debts. He lowered the axe and went to the hearth to build a fire. When he came out with a steaming mug of chicory brew, she had already split a formidable pile of wood. She stopped when she saw him, the axe held loosely at her side. She was breathing heavily, a fine sheen of sweat on her brow. He set the mug on the chopping block. "You'll pull your stitches." She glanced at her bandaged arm, then back at him. "The debt is not paid." "There is no debt," he said. He looked at the pile of wood. "But the help is welcome." She watched him, her suspicion still a wall between them, but he thought he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Confusion. She picked up the mug, her large hands making it look like a child's toy. She didn't drink, just held it, letting the steam warm her face. And so their new rhythm began. It was a quiet, cautious dance. He would work the fields, and she would find tasks to do around the farmstead. She mended the stone wall where it had crumbled, lifting rocks that would have broken his back. She sharpened his tools on the grindstone until they held an edge he hadn't seen in years. She moved with a restless energy, as if staying still was a kind of poison. They rarely spoke. Words seemed like clumsy, unnecessary things. They communicated in actions. He would leave food for her on the porch. She would leave a neat stack of kindling by the door. He replaced the bandage on her arm every other day. She learned to clear the stones from the new field with a brutal efficiency that amazed him. One evening, a cold rain began to fall, turning the paths to black sludge. He was in the barn, oiling his tools by the light of a lantern. She was there too, sitting in her usual stall, methodically weaving a loose strand of straw into a complex braid. He worked, and she watched. It had become a familiar pattern. "You have a name?" he asked, the words feeling loud in the quiet space. She stopped breathing. "They called me chattel, beast, it." "That's what they called you," he said, not looking up from the hole he was cleaning. "That's not your name." The silence stretched again. The only sound was the rain drumming on the barn roof. "Graca," she said, her voice low. "Elias," he replied. It felt like a treaty being signed. He risked a glance at her. She was looking at her hands, at the straw braid. For the first time, the hard line of her mouth seemed to soften, just for an instant. A few nights later, he woke to the smell of smoke. Panic seized him for a cold second before he realized it was the smell of the hearth. He had forgotten to bank the fire properly before sleep, and the embers had died. The chill of the house was seeping into him. He sat up, groaning at the stiffness in his back from another night in the chair, and saw a figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the hearth. It was Graca. She was kneeling on the stones, carefully feeding small slivers of wood into the embers, blowing on them with a soft, steady breath. A tiny flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on her stern, focused face. She had come in from the barn, had seen the dead fire, and had rekindled it. She must have felt his eyes on her because she looked over. Her face was unreadable in the firelight. He simply nodded his thanks. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod in return, then rose and slipped back out into the night, as silent as a shadow. He got up and added a larger log to the fire, the warmth already pushing back the cold. He looked at the empty doorway she had disappeared through. It was a small thing, keeping a fire lit, but in the cold, lonely world he inhabited, it felt as large as the mountain. It was an act of care, a reciprocal gesture. Something was changing between them. The ground was thawing. The next day, as they worked in the field, clearing a new patch for potatoes, he spoke of his son. He hadn't meant to. The words just came out, unearthed like the stones they were pulling from the soil. "This was to be his field," Elias said, gesturing with a dirt-caked hand. "Thomas. He had a way with the land, better than me." Graca stopped working, a heavy rock balanced in her hands. She didn't speak, just listened. The fever took him, and his mother a year later. It hollows you out, a loss like that. He stared at the dark, empty earth. Leaves you quiet. He expected her to grunt and turn back to her work. Orcs, he'd heard, had no time for grief. It was a weakness. But she didn't. She walked over and took the heavy stone from his side of the row and carried it to the wall, her own load still in her other hand. She did his work for him for the next hour, letting him stand there with his ghosts. It was her way of showing understanding. Her silence was not empty. It was respectful. That evening, by the fire, she spoke. "I had a command," she said, her voice a low rumble. She was staring into the flames, her amber eyes reflecting the light. "Warriors, a shield band. We were the blood-tusk guard." Elias listened, nursing his mug of chicory. This was more than she had ever offered. There was a challenge for leadership. It was not honorable. She touched a faint scar on her temple. It was betrayal. An arrow in the dark. A knife in the ribs. My second, Gorgut. He wanted my position, my name. She fell silent, but he could see the battle replaying in her eyes. The fire, the blood, the treachery. He sold me to the first slaver, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. A chieftain's daughter, sold for iron trinkets, a fate worse than death, a way to break my spirit. Her hands clenched into fists. He did not succeed. No, he thought, he did not. He now understood the fire in her eyes, the unyielding pride. She wasn't just a slave. She was a fallen leader, a betrayed warrior. The iron collar had been more than a restraint. It had been a calculated humiliation. And he, a simple farmer, had stumbled into the middle of her war. The thought should have terrified him. He looked at her, at the strength that radiated from her even in repose, and he felt a strange sense of rightness. This was where he was supposed to be. The first sign of trouble came a week later. It was subtle, a broken branch on a game trail when no game would break it, a footprint in the mud by the creek that was too large and too deep to be his. He found it while checking his snares. It was the print of a heavy iron-shod boot, an orc's boot. He smoothed it over with his own foot and went back to the farm, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't say anything to Graka. What was there to say? That her past was walking up the valley? She already knew. She lived with it every day. But she noticed the change in him. She saw how his eyes scanned the tree line, how he paused in his work to listen to the wind. That evening, as he was sharpening the head of his wood axe on the whetstone, she came and stood beside him. "They are coming," she said. It was not a question. "I saw a track," he admitted, not stopping the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. One scout means a war party is not far behind," she stated. "Gorgut will not leave a thread loose. He will want proof of my death or my final disgrace." She looked around the small, peaceful farm. "He will burn this place to the ground to get it." "Then we should go," he said, the words tasting like ash. To leave his home, his land, it was all he had left. "Go where, old man?" she asked, her voice laced with a bitter irony. "There is no place for me to run. And you? This is your land, your life." She looked at him, her gaze intense. "I will not have it destroyed on my account. I will leave at dawn." No. The word was out before he could think. It was short, hard, and absolute, like a stone. She looked surprised. "You cannot stop me." "I know," he said, finally looking up at her. "But if you stay, there are two of us. If you go, you are one. And they will hunt you down in the wilderness. Here we have walls, a barn. This is ground I know." He was arguing to defend his home, he told himself. But it was more than that. The thought of the silence returning, of being alone again with just his ghosts. It was unbearable. Graka stared at him for a long time. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the warrior's instinct to protect the innocent warring with the pragmatic need to survive. "Your death will be on my hands," she said quietly. "My life is my own," he countered. "So is my death." She gave a slow, solemn nod. "Then we stand." The first attack came 3 days later. It wasn't the main force, it was a probing assault, 5 of them. They came at dusk, moving like shadows out of the woods. Elias saw them first, dark shapes slipping between the trees. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. Graka was already moving. She had been preparing. She had fashioned a brutal-looking club from a heavy piece of oak, and she had his father's old, rusty hunting spear. It wasn't a warrior's weapon, but it would have to do. "The barn," she commanded. "The doors are thick. We can bottleneck them there." He didn't argue. He grabbed his axe and followed her. They barricaded the main doors with an old cart and took up positions by the smaller side door, which they left slightly ajar. The farm was eerily quiet. The orcs were being cautious. They heard a crash from the house as one of the windows was smashed in. They were testing, trying to draw them out. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of his mother's rocking chair by the hearth, the small wooden bird his son had carved. Anger, cold and sharp, cut through his fear. Then a shadow fell across the opening of the side door. An orc peered in, his ugly face split by a confident sneer. He saw nothing in the gloom. He stepped inside. Graka moved like a viper. She drove the spear forward in a single, powerful thrust. The orc gave a choked grunt and collapsed, the spearhead buried in his chest. Before the body hit the ground, Graka was already moving past it, out the door, her club in hand. Elias scrambled after her. A second orc was right behind the first. He saw Elias and charged, his own axe raised. Elias wasn't a warrior, he was a farmer. He didn't know fancy moves. He just swung his wood axe in the same arc he used to fell a tree. The orc was expecting a block, a parry. He wasn't expecting a clumsy, desperate swing aimed at his knees. The axe bit deep into his thigh, severing muscle and bone. The orc screamed and went down. Outside, Graka was a whirlwind of controlled violence. She met the charge of 2 more orcs. Her club was a blur, blocking, striking, breaking. One went down with a crushed shoulder. The other fell back, his arm hanging at a useless angle. The 5th and final orc, seeing his companions fall so quickly, hesitated. That was his mistake. Graka lunged, her club swinging in a low, brutal arc that shattered his knee. It was over in less than a minute. The twilight was filled with the groans of the wounded. Graka stood over them, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a terrifying light. She was no longer the quiet farmhand. She was a chieftain, a warrior. She looked at Elias, at the axe in his hands, at the orc writhing on the ground at his feet. She nodded, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "You have a strong swing, farmer." "I chop a lot of wood," he said, his voice shaking slightly. They dragged the bodies away from the farmstead and dealt with the wounded. It was grim work. By the time they were done, full darkness had fallen. They knew this was just the beginning. The main force would come now, and it would be a flood, not a trickle. That night they sat in the wrecked farmhouse, the door barricaded. The window was a gaping hole, letting in the cold night air. Elias looked at the overturned furniture, the shattered pottery. His quiet life was over. It had been smashed to pieces. "They will bring more," Graka said, cleaning her spearhead with a rag. "Gorgut himself, maybe." "How many?" 20, 30, as many as he thinks it will take." Elias looked at his axe, at her club and spear. The odds were impossible. "We can't win." "No," she agreed, her voice grim. "We cannot." She looked at him, her face shadowed in the lantern light. "You should have let me leave, Elias." "Probably," he said. He looked around at the wreckage of his home. "But a man should be able to choose how his story ends. I won't end mine running." Her expression softened. "You are a strange human. You have the heart of a clan warrior, but the hands of a farmer." "The hands are old," he said, "but the heart still beats." They didn't have to wait long. The next wave of attackers came just before dawn. This time, there was no subtlety. A war horn blared from the edge of the woods, a deep, ugly sound that echoed off the mountains. Then came the shouts, the roar of a full war party. They made their stand in the barn as before. It was their only defensible position. The orcs came in a wave, their axes and swords glinting in the first light. They smashed against the barn doors, the thick wood groaning under the assault. Graka stood by the main doors, spear ready. Elias was by the smaller side door, his wood axe feeling pitifully small. "When the doors break," Graka said, her voice tight, "try to hold the side. Do not let them flank us." "I'll hold it," he promised. The main doors splintered, then burst inward. Orcs poured into the barn, a tide of snarling fury. Graka met them with a roar of her own. She was a demon, her spear a blur of motion. She fought with the desperate strength of a cornered lioness, defending her last patch of ground. An orc broke from the main group and charged the side door. Elias met him, swinging his axe. Their weapons clashed, the impact jarring his arms to the shoulder. He was older, weaker, but he was desperate. He shoved the orc back, kicked a stray bucket into his path and swung again. The axe caught the orc in the side, and he went down. Another took his place immediately. He fought in a daze. It was nothing like the first skirmish. This was a meat grinder. He was losing ground. He could feel his strength failing, his arms burning with exhaustion. He saw Graka go down to one knee, an arrow shaft sticking from her shoulder. She fought her way back up, roaring in pain and defiance, but she was flagging. Through the chaos, a new figure stepped through the shattered doorway. He was huge, even for an orc, clad in black iron plate armor. A jagged scar ran down one side of his face. He held a massive, two-handed axe. "Graka," he bellowed, "your pathetic resistance ends. I am Gorgut, and I will take your head and your name." He strode toward her, his warriors parting to let him through. Graka faced him, her spear held in a two-handed grip, blood dripping from the arrow wound in her shoulder. She was outnumbered, wounded, exhausted. It was over. Elias saw it. The end. He saw Gorgut raise his great axe, and in that moment, something in him broke. Not his courage, his resignation. He would not stand by and watch her die. He let out a yell, a raw, ragged sound born of grief and fury, and charged. Not at Gorgut, that would be suicide. He charged the wall of the barn, where he had stacked the winter firewood. He threw his shoulder against the pile. The logs were heavy, precariously balanced. With a groan of protesting wood, the entire stack, hundreds of pounds of oak and pine, collapsed outward, right into the flank of Gorgut's warriors. Orcs screamed as they were buried, their legs crushed. The line broke. The distraction was total. Gorgut whirled, his face contorted with rage, seeing the old human who had thrown his carefully planned assault into chaos. It was the opening Graka needed. She lunged, not at Gorgut, but past him, towards the barn wall where the farming tools hung. Her hand closed around the handle of a long, heavy-tined pitchfork. She spun, the steel tines glinting. Gorgut laughed. "A farmer's tool. You disgrace our people." He charged. Graka didn't try to block his blow. She sidestepped, letting the massive axe head smash into the dirt floor where she had been standing. And as he was off balance, she drove the pitchfork forward with all her remaining strength. It wasn't a noble weapon. It was a brutal, ugly tool. And it was brutally, ugly, effective. The steel tines punched through the thinner plate of Gorgut's gorget and deep into his throat. His eyes went wide with shock. A gurgling sound escaped his lips. He dropped his axe and clawed at the pitchfork embedded in his neck. He took 2 stumbling steps and fell, his lifeblood pumping out into the dirt and straw. Silence. The remaining orcs stared, stunned, at their fallen leader. They looked at Graka, standing over him, wounded and bleeding, but undeniably victorious. They looked at the old human, covered in dust, panting for breath. Graka pulled the pitchfork free. She stood tall, her back straight despite her wounds. She pointed the bloody tines at the stunned warriors. "Gorgut was a traitor," she roared, her voice ringing with power. "He sold his chieftain into slavery. He fought with treachery, not honour. I am Graka of the Blood Tusk. This clan is mine by right of blood and battle." She then did something that shocked everyone, Elias most of all. She turned and walked to him, her steps unwavering. She stood before him, the battered farmer, in front of all her warriors. "This man," she declared, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the barn, "this human, Elias, stood when all others had fled. He fought for a clan that was not his. He showed the courage Gorgut lacked." She reached up and took his calloused, dirt-stained hand. "I claim him," she said, her voice dropping but still carrying to every corner of the barn. "He is hearthkin. He is mine. To harm him is to challenge me. To disrespect him is to disrespect your chieftain." She was not offering him protection. She was offering him a place, a title, a life. She was tying him to her, publicly, irrevocably. It was a political act, a declaration of a new order, an orc chieftain and her human consort. It was unthinkable. The orcs looked at each other, then at the dead Gorgut, and then at her. One by one they began to kneel, first the ones who had been loyal to her in their hearts, then the others, swayed by her victory and her sheer force of will. They knelt in the dirt and blood of the barn, accepting her as their leader once more. Later, after the enemy had been routed and the wounded tended to, Graka found him by the ruins of his house. The barn had survived mostly. The house was a wreck, half burned, his life's possessions turned to ash. "They have accepted me," she said, coming to stand beside him. Her arm was in a proper sling now, her other wounds cleaned and bound. "We will leave at first light. We must go back to the hold and cleanse it of Gorgut's rot." He stared at the smoking timbers of his home. "What about me?" "My offer stands," she said. "A place by my side. You will be honored, protected. You will want for nothing." He thought about it. A life of ease, protected by a fierce warrior chieftain. It was more than he could ever have dreamed of. And it felt wrong. "I don't want to be protected," he said slowly, turning to face her. "I'm not a pet or a trophy." A flicker of hurt crossed her face. "That is not what I offer." "I know," he said gently, "but it's what they will see, the weak human kept by the strong orc chieftain." He held up his hands. "These are not the hands of a warrior. They're the hands of a farmer, a smith when I have to be. I mend things, I build things. That is my strength." He took a breath. "I will come with you, but not as your hearthkin to be sheltered. I will come as Elias, your smith, your farmer. I will forge your steel and grow your food. I will stand beside you, not behind you." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and he saw understanding dawn in her amber eyes. He was not rejecting her. He was defining his own terms. He was demanding to be seen for what he was, not for the title she had given him. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her. "Then stand beside me, Elias the farmer," she said, "and we will rebuild my clan together." They left the next morning. He took nothing with him but the axe on his belt and the clothes on his back. There was nothing left to take. He did not look back at the smoking ruins of his farm as they walked down the valley path. His old life was over. His new one was just beginning. The months that followed were harder than any season of farming he had ever endured. The orc hold was a cold, brutal place of stone and iron. He was met with suspicion, with contempt. The human, the chieftain's pet. He ignored it. He did what he had always done. He worked. Graka gave him the hold's old abandoned forge. It was a ruin of rusted tools and a broken bellows. He cleaned it. He repaired it. He built a new quenching trough and organized the scraps of iron. He began to work. He sharpened their dull axes until they could shave hair. He mended their dented armor. He forged new plowshares for the hard, rocky soil in the high valleys, teaching them techniques they had never seen. He spoke little, he just worked. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to respect him. They saw that his work made their lives better. His ploughs brought in more crops. His keen-edged axes made their work easier. His careful repairs to their armour saved lives in the skirmishes with rival clans. They stopped calling him the human. They started calling him Smith, or Old Man. It was a kind of acceptance. He was not one of them. He never would be. But he had a place, an earned place. One evening, a year after they had left his farm, Graka came to the forge. He was working late, finishing a new breastplate for her. It was his finest work, shaped and hammered to fit her perfectly, the steel gleaming in the forge light. She stood in the doorway watching him, just as she had watched him in the barn on that first day. So much had changed. The tension between them was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet comfort. "It is finished," he said, setting down his hammer. She came forward. "Let me see." He held it up. She ran a hand over the smooth, strong steel. "It is good work." "You need to try it on," he said, to check the fit. She unbuckled her old, battered armour and let it fall to the stone floor. She stood before him in a simple leather tunic. He lifted the new breastplate. It was heavy, but it felt right in his hands. He settled it over her shoulders. It fit as if it had been grown there. He moved behind her to fasten the leather straps. His knuckles brushed against her back. Her skin was warm. She did not flinch. His hands, which had once trembled to even touch her, were now steady and sure. He tightened the last buckle, his movements practiced and familiar. "It is a good fit," she said, her voice a low murmur. He came to stand before her, his hands resting lightly on the steel shoulders of the armour he had made. "It will protect you. You have protected me from the day we met, Elias," she said, her amber eyes soft in the firelight. "Not with a sword, but with this." She placed a hand over his heart, with a strength Gorgut could never understand. He looked at her, the warrior chieftain in the armour he had forged, and he saw not a master, but a partner, an equal. He had lost everything, his home, his past, his quiet life. But here, in the fire and noise of an orc forge, surrounded by violence and a people not his own, he had found something he thought had been buried forever with his wife and son. He had found a purpose. He had found a home. He had been seen. Did you enjoy this story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot, and drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.